Welcome to the Conover Auditorium at the Dodd Research Center. Please note that in case of an emergency or fire, there are two exits to the auditorium. One is the main entrance, located at the rear of the auditorium. The front emergency exit is located off the stage to your right, behind the podium. Please note the nearest exit to your seat. We would like to remind you that there is no smoking allowed throughout the building, and to turn off or silence your cell phone during the program. Restrooms are located down the hallway into the parking lot on the left-hand side. Thank you for your attention. So good evening, my name is Damon Reynolds. I am the chairman of the Undergraduate Student Government External Affairs Committee. I would like to thank the candidates and panelists for attending tonight's discussion on the future of Connecticut and the Office of Attorney General. I'd like to welcome the candidates, Green Party nominee Peter Goselin, Democrat Party nominee William Tong, along with our moderators, Professor of Political Science Virginia Ettinger, and Daily Campus correspondent Jacob Kowalski. No signs are allowed, and there will be no clapping or booing from the audience during the duration of the event. You will be asked to leave and removed from the Dodd Center if there is disruptive behavior, although I hope we don't have to deal with any of that tonight. All questions will be asked by the moderators, Professor Ettinger and Mr. Kowalski. The entirety of this event will be live streamed and recorded by both the Dodd Center and UCTV. Freedom of speech and the vigorous exchange of ideas are core values at the University of Connecticut. It is the duty of every member of our community to protect our rights, to listen to, engage with, and even challenge speakers with whom we may disagree. In order to preserve those fundamental freedoms, we need to allow people to speak without interruption during events, including invited speakers and members of the audience during question and answer sessions. Preventing people from exercising their right goes against our identity as a university, and anyone who does so may be removed from the event. Thank you for helping us fulfill our mission as a vibrant and resilient intellectual community. Now, the format of tonight's forum is as follows. Candidates will be allotted 2 minutes for opening statements. Candidates will be given 2 minutes to answer each question, and the initial candidate will receive 1 minute to rebut. This will be followed by a lightning round and the opportunity for 2-minute closing statements. I'd like to hand it off to Professor Ettinger to begin the opening statements.
Excuse me, we have a technical difficulty. Mr. Tong, Mr. Goselin, thank you for joining us tonight. As Damon said, we'll begin with a 2-minute statement from each of you. Having won the coin toss back to stage, Mr. Tong is going to go first, followed by Mr. Goselin. After that, we will alternate questions between the candidates with the initial response to the first question going to Mr. Goselin. Mr. Tong, your opening statement, please.
I lost the coin toss, which is why I'm going first. Thank you, Damon, Professor, and UConn for having us here tonight. And Peter, it's great to be with you for this debate, and I think it'll be more of a discussion. As I was driving up, I was thinking to myself, I went to camp here when I was a kid, and I still consider myself a young person. But many of the faces here were born after I graduated from law school and began working. And it struck me that I've been in the same place that you are now, in an auditorium like this. And I was told by people older than me that I alone was responsible for my future, that my generation had a special responsibility and a duty to change the world. And that we as a generation confronted special risks like generations before us, like the greatest generation, my grandparents, the boomers who are my parents. I'm Generation X, the jury is still out on us. But I think this is especially true for all of you and the undergraduates at UConn now and those of you who are soon to graduate, because you've had an altogether different experience. You grew up in the aftermath of 9/11, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression. So in many ways, you're a generation with far more experience at a young age, and you're much more clear-eyed about the world, and I think much more pragmatic, and ready to take on these challenges. And the challenges are immense. They're existential. In my view, the reason why I'm running is because the President of the United States is leading an unprecedented attack on our way of life here in Connecticut. And if you're a woman, if you're an immigrant, if you're a Connecticut taxpayer, it's pretty clear that the President of the United States has declared war on you and your family. From the environment to the Affordable Care Act to an administration that simply does not recognize or believe in climate change. I think that this generation sitting here and watching us on live stream and attending this university now has a special and urgent responsibility to be the first and the last line of defense to protect our way of life. As your Attorney General, it will be my job to stand side by side with you and help you lead that fight. Thank you for having us here tonight.
Mr. Goselin?
Well, there's a good chance that most of you will not have read or an in-depth profile about me or seen me on TV news. So I think I'd like to start there, give you a little bit of an idea of who I am and what brings me to this place. I grew up in Connecticut. My dad was a shipyard worker. My mother was a homemaker. They raised 6 kids, and most of us stayed in Connecticut. And in 1978, I came here to the University of Connecticut as an undergraduate. 2 years later, I left the University of Connecticut because in the interim, the United States had restarted a program which they had discontinued for a number of years of registration for the military draft. I had refused to register for the military draft. I publicly refused. And because of that, my financial aid was cut off and I had no choice but to leave school. After that, I worked in a number of different jobs. I worked at unloading trucks. I worked stocking grocery shelves. I worked in data entry. I ended up as a healthcare worker for a number of years. And it was in that context that I first became a shop steward for the Healthcare Workers Union. I was then the chief shop steward for the hospital that I worked at, and that led me to law school. I went back to school, finished my degree, got my degree from Charter Oak College, graduated with honors from UConn Law School, and I've been practicing labor and employment law in Connecticut for about 23 years now. Now, labor and employment law, what that means in essence for me is that I spend my time representing working people against employers who have victimized them in one way or another. They've harassed them or discriminated against them, they've underpaid them, they've cheated them, and my job is to try to bring a little bit of justice to that situation. I also do a fair amount of First Amendment work representing political organizations against local bureaucrats and the police when they're trying to exercise their First Amendment rights.
Thank you, Mr. Goselin. If you go over, I'm going to just try to gently
Absolutely.
nudge you to cede the floor to your opponent.
Would it be possible to get a 30-second warning?
See the gentleman right there in the gray sweater?
You would raise your hand for 30 seconds? That'd be great. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, so for our first question, Mr. Goselin, what are some of your overall goals if elected to the position of Attorney General? In particular, we were wondering if there are certain new initiatives you would pursue, and if there are other priorities from the current Attorney General that you would discard, continue, or change.
Well, first of all, with respect to the Attorney General's office, I believe that the function of this office is really to protect the civil rights and civil liberties of the residents of the state of Connecticut. It's the highest ranking civil legal authority in the state. In that context, there are a few things. When I made a decision to run for Attorney General, I had a few things in my mind. The number one item on my mind was a problem that I've seen up close and a really ugly problem, which is the state of police enforcement in urban areas in Connecticut. If you're a person of color and you live in Bridgeport or Waterbury or Hartford, and especially if you're a young person, you have good reason to be afraid that if you're out on the street and you have to deal with the cops, that you could end up being harassed, you could end up getting beat up, you could get arrested, you could get killed. In the last couple of months, I've been at a couple of memorial services for young people who were killed by police officers in circumstances that completely did not warrant it. And so the idea of using the authority of the Attorney General's office to enforce Connecticut civil rights laws against police departments and police officers who brutalize young people and people of color is particularly important to me. That's the number one item on my list. Along with that, as I mentioned, I do labor and employment law. One of the other areas that's of particular concern to me is the problem of wage theft. Literally every year, literally millions of dollars in workers' wages get stolen by employers. And this is especially immigrant workers, especially undocumented immigrants. And the Attorney General's office already plays some role in that. It needs to play a much bigger role.
Thank you, Mr. Goselin. Mr. Tong, same question. Certain initiatives you wish to pursue and any priorities from the current Attorney General that you would continue or change or discard?
Yes, thank you for that question. I should also note that I'm both the Democratic and Working Families Party nominee for Attorney General, and I'm proud to be the nominee for both parties. And I have to agree with Peter, one of the biggest priorities facing our state is to ensure that the Attorney General's office has the authority to step forward and take action, affirmative action on behalf of the state's residents to protect their civil rights and enforce those rights. That's why I'm the only candidate in this race that's called for the creation of a civil rights division. New York has a civil rights division, Massachusetts has a civil rights division. We don't have that authority under state law because the Attorney General is a creature of statute and the Constitution. And there's a case called Blumenthal versus Barnes that requires that the legislature give affirmative authority to the Attorney General to take action on behalf of the people of this state. And so I would leverage my experience as chairman of the Judiciary Committee. I have overall responsibility for our state's legal system to go to the legislature and encourage them to pass a law to create a civil rights division so the Attorney General could step forward and file suit on behalf of the residents of this state to enforce their civil rights. I also think that it's important to move away from a system of mass incarceration here in this state and really engage in criminal justice reform, and that's why I wrote the Second Chance Society law, the bail reform law, and the excessive use of force law, the three pillars of the Second Chance Society that has made Connecticut a leader in criminal justice reform among the 50 states.
Thank you, Mr. Tong. Mr. Goselin, 1 minute to respond.
Obviously, I think that the steps that Mr. Tong has supported as a legislator are positive steps in the right direction. But I will take note of the fact that when we're talking about Connecticut's excessive force law, I went and took a look at the history of it on the books today. Essentially, this is a statute that's been on the books for a number of years, and every year or every 2 years or every 3 years, legislators go back and amend it. And they amend it, and they amend it, and they amend it. And yet, curiously, young people are not dying in fewer numbers than they were before. And there isn't less excessive force, there's more. We have to deal with the problem of the militarization of police departments. It's not just a Connecticut problem, it's a national problem. But until we get police departments under control, we're not going to be able to stop these killings.
Thank you. Mr. Tong, this question goes
Sure.
to you first. Attorney General Jepsen has been playing a central role in a coalition of state attorney generals to take steps toward legal action against drug manufacturers in response to the opioid epidemic. Will you continue this effort? And if the answer to that is yes, how will your experience benefit in this effort? And if your answer is no, could you share with us why you don't think this would be a priority?
So picking up from the previous question, I think these are among the two highest priorities in the office right now. Not only is Attorney General Jepsen part of the coalition, he's the leader of the coalition. And in the investigation of the opioid crisis. And I think what's really important is that General Jepsen has moved beyond just an investigation focused on the big pharmaceutical companies, but he's expanded the investigation to distributors, and I think we have to go even further and investigate the entire addiction industry. And I think that includes the big pharmaceutical companies, the distributors, the pharmacy benefit managers, major pharmacy chains, even healthcare providers and treatment centers. Because the reason I think that we have a crisis across Connecticut and across the country is because there is a system that makes money off of people's addictions and off of their misery. And even if one individual actor isn't culpable, there are links in the chain and financial incentives, payments, kickbacks, all of those things have to be investigated. And I would take it even further and be even more thorough. So would step right into Attorney General Jepsen's shoes as a leader of the coalition. We're also leading 48 states in the generic drug manufacturer's price fixing case. That has already matured to litigation, and there's pretty brazen evidence that the generic drug manufacturers are actively colluding to fix prices, sometimes as high as 1,000% more than people pay in other places like Canada. And so those are two vital pieces of litigation. This will require a commitment not just of the Attorney General's office, but of the legislature and the governor to continue to support the Attorney General's office in pursuing these investigations and litigations. And my experience as a legislator will help ensure that we have the resources to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Tong. Mr. Goselin?
I fully support the steps that Jepsen's AG's office has taken with respect to opioids. But I want to point something out. That when we're talking about opioids, we're not just talking about the problems with oxy that we've been seeing over the last few years, and deaths associated with that. Because for some reason, actually I think we know the reason, but for some reason when young white people are becoming addicted to OxyContin, that's a health crisis. But for years and years, when black people were becoming addicted to heroin and were ending up in jail for it, it was a criminal justice problem. When it was crack cocaine, it was a criminal justice problem. Now, all of a sudden we've decided that the problem is that people are being preyed upon by drug manufacturers. I believe that that's true, but I think that in order for us to talk honestly about the problem of the addiction industry, we also have to talk about the war on drugs. We have to talk about the fact that there are still people in jail who, if they were white and if they were addicted to oxy, would not be in jail. There are people in jail who, if they were caught smoking pot or for some small amount of marijuana, there are still people in jail for those offenses. We have to, in order to properly deal with this issue, not only do we have to go after the opioid manufacturers, we also have to end the war on drugs, legalize marijuana, make an effort to provide reparations for the communities that have been affected by the war on drugs, and begin a program of public health that's directed at the sort of things they do in Europe for drug addiction, like providing safe injection sites, for example, clean needle exchanges. Those are things that are going to be absolutely vital in order to address this problem. Otherwise, it's just window dressing.
Thank you, Mr. Goselin. Mr. Tong, 1 minute. Anything you'd like to add?
I think that Peter has made some excellent points about the crisis in our cities, and that's why I wrote and passed the Second Chance Society law. And with respect, I don't think it's enough to talk about it, but you have to do something about it, and we have in the legislature. We did some very difficult things in the legislature, and my Republican colleagues demagogued the issue. They tried to accuse Democrats of not being sufficiently strong on crime, and we're very tough about violent crime, but we also know that a system of mass incarceration doesn't work, and that draconian mandatory minimum sentences for simple drug possession don't work, that draconian minimum mandatory sentences for marijuana possession don't work, and that the drug-free zones law that we had in this state that routinely penalized people of color more than people in our suburbs didn't work and were grossly unfair and unjust, and that's why we passed that law.
Thank you, Mr. Tong. Mr. Goselin, Connecticut is one of 30 states that have legalized marijuana for medical purposes, but the list of covered illnesses is restricted, especially for children. For example, cancer and PTSD in children are not qualifying illnesses. Would you share your thoughts on expanding the list of qualifying illnesses for adults, children, or both?
Well, again, I happen to support legalization of marijuana. So to some extent, the problem of what adults will be allowed to take it is largely resolved in that manner. However, I do favor an extensive expansion of the categories for medical marijuana for adults, for the simple reason that obviously what we're looking for is a point in time when we can make sure that people can not only have access to it, but they can have access to it and their insurance will cover it, so that they can actually afford it, so they can get the help that they need. I think that following up on the discussion we had just a moment ago about the war on drugs, Attorney Tong has made an interesting point, which is that the legislature is the one that actually does things about it, and that's absolutely true. You have to do something about it. I started doing something about it when we worked on the Ban the Box initiative in Hartford and in Norwich. That was, 10 years ago? And it took us years to be able to get it from that point into the State House and into legislation. The young people that are dying now from opioids, heroin addiction, the folks who are going to jail for these offenses can't wait. They can't wait another 10 years for this problem to be resolved. We have to take action to end the war on drugs now.
Can you repeat the question again,
Sure.
please?
Connecticut is one of 30 states to legalize marijuana
Yes.
for medical purposes, but the list of covered illnesses is restrictive, especially in comparison to other states. And in particular, children are covered, have many fewer qualifying illnesses. For example, cancer and PTSD are not included in the list of children's illnesses that can receive a medical marijuana. Would you share your thoughts on expanding the list for adults, for children, or both?
Yes, so as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I'm one of the architects of the medical marijuana program. And we have one of the strongest, it's reputed to be the best medical marijuana program in the country because it is generally seen as being the most well-regulated, the most rooted in therapy and in science, and the most tied to medicine. And so in that way, I think we have a very strong regulatory regime that's run by the Department of Consumer Protection. And I do think that every year, and just this year, they try to expand the list of conditions that are treated by the medical marijuana program. I should turn also to the issue about access to the medical marijuana program for children. That was a very contentious issue, and I led passage of the bill that permitted the use of the medical marijuana program by minors. As you can imagine, when that was first proposed, it was very controversial. But I remember the public hearing, and a young man named Hunter came in with his mom, and he was wearing a helmet. I don't think he was more than 10 years old. And the reason why he wears a helmet is because he suffers debilitating grand mal seizures several times a day, sometimes for hours on end. And we understood then, as a committee, Democrats and Republicans, that it made no sense to deny medicine to Hunter and to his family to address very real and catastrophic epilepsy that he's afflicted by and needs treatment for. So we've taken those steps, and I think we continue to look at treatments and therapies linked to marijuana that can help people like Hunter.
Mr. Goselin, anything to add?
Ultimately, this is part and parcel of the problem of lack of access to healthcare. Healthcare is a fundamental right. It should something that should be recognized. When we're talking about access to medical marijuana, it's true, the states that have medical marijuana programs are far ahead in terms of their public health programs compared to those that don't. But if people can't access it, they don't have the money to access it, it doesn't help them. And right now we have a for-profit system that's to a large extent based in Connecticut because of the insurance industries that are located here. And we have to be prepared to take on those insurance industries and essentially dismantle them in favor of a single-payer healthcare system that guarantees that everybody has access to quality healthcare that's free.
Thank you. Now I'm going to turn the podium over to my moderating colleague, Jacob Kowalski.
Thank you, Professor Henninger. Let's briefly stay on the topic of marijuana. It is currently legal recreationally in 9 states and Washington, D.C. How would you counsel the state legislature if they chose to pursue legalization? And if such a law is enacted, what steps would you recommend concerning previous convictions and those currently serving time for marijuana possession? Mr. Tong, your responses first.
Thank you. So we've tried over a number of years to pass a law in the legislature and particularly on the Judiciary Committee to legalize the recreational use of marijuana. As a committee, we've not been successful. There are a lot of challenges around drafting that law in a way that works for Connecticut, and we haven't been able to find unanimity on that and sufficient votes to get it out of the Judiciary Committee. As Attorney General, neither of us will have a vote, but if the legislature passes it, I'll defend that law 150%. And our job will be to stand close with the legislature as they draft a law and provide advice, particularly under Attorney General Sessions, about the risks posed to the state by what I think is probably a draconian and unfair approach to enforcement by Attorney General Sessions. And so my job will be to provide counsel to the legislature as they do that. And I think going forward, there's going to be a robust debate in the legislature about recreational marijuana. And given where the president is right now, it's fraught with a lot of risks to the state, and so the Attorney General has to play an active role in that.
Mr. Goselin, your response?
I believe that part of the role of the Attorney General is to counsel the legislature even before they have taken action. And my counsel to them on the issue of access, legalization of marijuana would be, what in the world are you waiting for? The state of Massachusetts is about to start selling it retail, over the counter. And Connecticut obviously is losing the opportunity to secure tax revenue from it. And I fail to see the differences between Massachusetts and Connecticut that it would be so vast that we would say, oh, we can't figure out how in the world to do this here, even though they can do it across the border. But I think really more importantly, and I touched on this before, the plain fact of the matter is that the war on drugs for decades sapped the resources from the poorest and most oppressed communities in the United States. It sent tens of thousands of young people to jail. It turned communities into crime zones. It led to the militarization of the police that we have today. We can't simply turn the tap off now and say, oh, that's no longer going to be a problem. So you folks, who've been going to jail for having marijuana before, well, you're not going to go to jail anymore, but I tell you what, now we're going to put the business of marijuana into the hands of rich white pharmaceutical executives so that they can make a profit off of it. I think that if we're going to talk about ending the war on drugs, which we have to do, if we're going to talk about recreational marijuana, which we have to do, part of that has to be reparations for the communities that we have harmed through the war on drugs. And part of that, frankly, is going to be involving those communities in the process of becoming part of that industry. There's an organization in Connecticut of people of color that is devoted to taking up the issue of becoming part of the cannabis industry. And I applaud that. I think it's a great idea because this money needs to go back into that community, the community that was being robbed for literally decades because of the prohibition era attitudes towards drugs that again turned many cities into poverty zones and war zones.
Mr. Tong, your rebuttal?
So the second part of your question, which I didn't get to, is that there is a procedure already under state law for getting a conviction expunged from your record if the conduct you were convicted of is no longer illegal. And so we need to make that more available to people so that people understand that's available to them. We need to streamline that process so it's not so difficult. And I've been very strongly in support of ban-the-box legislation and also legislation to remove convictions for simple drug possession from your record after a period of years. We've talked about having it after 5 years. Some people want it after 10 years. But that discussion is a very active discussion in the legislature. And I think all of that is really important to building a true second chance society and picking up again on the second chance society law and the bail reform law and the excessive use of force law, which, as I said earlier, are the three pillars of the second chance society here in Connecticut.
All right, thank you. Mr. Goselin, this question is for you. There are likely a number of undocumented students at the University of Connecticut and many more undocumented immigrants in the state. What role does the Connecticut Attorney General have in supporting or resisting federal efforts to remove undocumented individuals?
Well, let me start here. It's frankly, as a labor lawyer, I pioneered the litigation of cases representing undocumented immigrant workers who were being ripped off by their employers. That's a program that's expanded far beyond me now. I'm not the only one that does it anymore, but frankly, most of the attorneys in Connecticut who do that kind of work, I taught it to them. Because it was clear to me even 10, 15 years ago that we had a serious problem where people who were working hard were being doubly taken advantage of. They were being terrorized by ICE on the one hand, and then on the other hand, attorneys also sometimes, but employers and landlords in particular were exploiting the fact that these people had reason to be afraid and taking advantage of them and breaking the laws when it came to particular employment and housing. So these are issues that I've been working on for a long time. One of the things, Connecticut has a Trust Act, which is definitely a step in the right direction, but I want to make an observation, and I know that there are folks here in the audience who know specifically what I'm talking about, that we know that there have been many, many occasions since the Trust Act was passed in which state of Connecticut judicial officials, correctional officials, police departments have deliberately held undocumented immigrants in violation of the Trust Act so that they could be turned over to ICE. And one of the things that we need to do when we're talking about the Trust Act is actually enforce it and make sure that people's rights are being protected in that respect. One of the other things with respect to the problem of immigration that is especially important to me is that I talk to friends who are criminal defense attorneys and they tell me about how terrorized their clients are because they have to worry about ICE coming into Connecticut courthouses looking for low-hanging fruit to try to find somebody that they can detain and deport. And that should be the subject of a lawsuit by the Attorney General's office against the United States government because they are effectively impeding the access of residents of Connecticut to the court system and the legal system.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Tong?
So one of the scariest moments over the last couple of years was hearing that the President of the United States has formed a task force to denaturalize immigrant American citizens, like my parents. So this is not a legal issue for me. This is real life. And what I share with the students who are undocumented is that my father at one point was undocumented and considered illegal. So for a lot of us, this is a very deeply personal issue, which is why I voted to provide driver's licenses to undocumented workers, which is why I voted to provide in-state tuition to undocumented students, which is why this year for Dreamers we provided financial aid at this institution for undocumented students. And it's why I defended the Trust Act this year against an attempted repeal by my Republican colleagues. And I agree that their attorney generals, one of the attorney general's highest priorities and responsibilities is to defend all of us, including immigrants here in Connecticut, and that includes defending the Trust Act, which I've helped to draft and revise every year since it passed in 2013. I should note that my Republican colleague, a Republican competitor who's not here tonight, is an ardent supporter of the president's immigration policy. And when she was asked whether she supports the president's policy of separating children from their families at the border, and then having the president promptly lose those children in foster homes across the country so that they could not be reunited with their parents, she said simply, "Yes, I do." And that's the stark choice in this race between me and the Republican candidate.
All right, Mr. Goselin, your rebuttal?
Well, Mr. Tong has stepped outside the box now, and we're now talking about the person who's not in the room. So let me take that a step further. All of the measures that William Tong talks about and takes credit for are to his credit. There's no question about that. But the plain fact is that the Democratic Party as a whole does not stand for these things. It has not played an aggressive role in defending the rights of immigrants. It has not played an aggressive role in reuniting families. It has not played an aggressive role in protecting undocumented workers in the workplace. And one of the things that I believe we need to do is to build a political party that's actually capable of standing up consistently and wholeheartedly for the rights of immigrant workers and the rights of all workers. Woo!
All right, thank you. Mr.
May I
Tong?
respond to that?
Sorry, that's outside the format of the debate.
Okay.
We agreed to, so we'll just stick with the current format. All right, Mr. Tong, this next question is for you. Affordability of college education is one of the most important issues to students. In light of the relaxing of student loan oversight by the current federal administration, what specific steps would you take to protect students from predatory loan practices?
So I will answer that question, but I'm sorry, I cannot let that comment go unchallenged. The truth is that some of the hardest working social justice champions in our state, like Gary Holder Winfield of New Haven, like Robin Porter of New Haven, like Tony Walker of New Haven, are Democrats. And they're the architects, Roland Lamar, of the Trust Act that, Peter, you say we have to defend. So to say that Democrats haven't taken lead on defending immigrants here in Connecticut is just wrong. And frankly, it does a disservice to all the people that work extraordinarily hard day in and day out to fight for immigrants like my family. That being said, as the president dismantles the CFPB, Dodd-Frank says that state attorneys general have to step in and fill the void. And so if we don't have the CFPB, it will be my job as your attorney general to take on predatory lending in the student loan space. One of the pioneers in talking about that issue in this race is Claire Kindle, who's sitting right here, and I'm grateful for her support. But going after predatory lending in the student loan space, in particular lending that does not provide full disclosure to students about what they're getting into, is one of the most important responsibilities that we'll take on. I'm sure that Claire is chomping at the bit to jump all over that. And so that'll be one of the highest priorities for us in the new year in the Attorney General's office.
All right, Mr. Goselin?
In all fairness, I don't disagree with anything you've said. But with respect to what we talked about earlier, I didn't say that there weren't any Democrats. What I said is the Democratic Party has not consistently and wholeheartedly defended the rights of immigrants, and that's just a fact. When we were marching in 2005, in 2008, in 2010, in 2012, the Democrats were not there with us. It took them years to finally get in the line and realize that these were issues that were important. And the reason they realized it was important is because we fought for those rights. We fought for those rights in our organizations, and we didn't stop when they said, oh, it's not respectable to talk, what we used to call illegal aliens, right? It's not respectable to talk about illegal aliens. You can't insist on them being called undocumented workers. Our political organizations that fought to change those things eventually were able to convince the Democratic Party to get in line on some of them. And to Mr. Tong's credit, he has played an important role during the time that the Democratic Party has taken a positive role in those areas. But it's not consistent, and it's historically not true that they've been the leaders.
All right, thank you. Mr. Tong, your rebuttal.
Peter's point is that a Democratic president was responsible for Japanese internment, and that Democrats and Republicans are responsible for the Chinese Exclusion Act, for example, and that Republicans are responsible for slavery. I agree, but it is patently false to suggest that Democrats in the legislature have not taken the lead on protecting immigrants and promoting social justice here in the state. And I've cited over and over again 3 critical nation-leading initiatives, including providing driver's licenses to undocumented workers, providing in-state tuition and then financial aid to undocumented students or dreamers, and then writing the Trust Act, which is one of the strongest acts in the nation to protect immigrants here in Connecticut. It's a fact that Democrats have taken the lead on that.
All right, this next question is for Mr. Goselin. If the 2018 election results in a governor and/or state legislature under the control of a different party, how would that affect your goals? Are there specific issues you believe you could work with other parties on? And how would this affect any federal lawsuits currently taking place?
Well, I regard it as inevitable that after the elections, the parties that will hold those offices will not be my political party. There's no question about that, and that's not an issue in contention. But I would say this, that one of the reasons that I decided to run in this race, one of the reasons that I took this up in the first place, and one of the reasons that I decided to work with folks from the Green Party in doing it, was that I believe that when I turn on the television and I see that there are 3 candidates for governor, there are 2 that are serious candidates for governor, right, the Republican and the Democrat, and they're both multimillionaires. And I know that neither one of those 2 people, no matter how well-intentioned they are, can represent my interests, because they don't know. They don't know what it's like to be on the unemployment line. They don't know what it is to be facing eviction or to have to make decisions about health care when you don't have enough money to pay the mortgage. I know that those are things that working people in this state have deep and desperate experience with. And I believe we have to build a political organization from the ground up that represents our interests, that puts our interests first, and that doesn't compromise on those questions. I don't believe that in the state of Connecticut, I don't believe that either of the major parties can do the things that are necessary in order to provide justice for working people when they are beholden to the privileged and the corporations.
Mr. Tong, your response?
So I have every confidence that Ned Lamont, who is the Democratic and Working Families Party nominee for governor, is going to be our next governor. And he's running on a very progressive agenda. And I think that, Ned supports paid family and medical leave. He supports a $15 minimum wage. And I think that Ned's message is resonating across Connecticut. But there is the possibility that Ned Lamont is not our next governor. And God forbid that Bob Stefanowski is our next governor. And I take Bob Stefanowski at his word that he intends to eliminate the income tax and to essentially eliminate half of the state's budget and to decimate our schools, to decimate this university, decimate our ability to fix our roads and bridges, decimate social services to people across Connecticut. And we've seen this movie before, because Attorney General Blumenthal was Attorney General only under Republican governors, including John Rowland and Jody Rell. And it will be on, I believe, a Democratic and Working Families Party Attorney General to step forward and articulate a strong, progressive vision for our state that values the work of working people, that honors the contributions of working people to this state, that honors the commitments that we've made to working people in exchange for their hard work, and that promotes social justice on issues like criminal justice reform, as we've discussed tonight, and also health care and protecting a woman's right to choose and her reproductive freedom. And so, as Attorney General, it will be my role, if we have a Republican governor, to use the bully pulpit of the Attorney General's office to speak out and push back in the legislature. And we've seen Dick Blumenthal do that for years and years, and I would follow in that model.
All right, 1 minute rebuttal from Mr. Goselin.
A couple of remarks that I've encountered frequently over the course of this campaign that I think are worth sharing. One of them has to do with Ned Lamont, and you probably have seen his campaign ads. So the one question that keeps on coming, two questions keep on coming up. One is, when's the last time Ned Lamont ate in a diner before he did that advertising? And the other is, does he really drive a Chevy? I mean, come on, this guy is a multimillionaire, right? Somehow I see that being presented to me on TV, and I'm offended by it. Because the suggestion seems to be that I'm so gullible as a voter that I'm going to just accept the idea that Ned Lamont is a friend of working people and that somehow he has my interests at heart, even though he's a multimillionaire. Is he better than Stefanowski? Yeah, he has better views than Stefanowski. But when I think about my experience as a state worker in the state of Connecticut before I went to law school, and I think about the experiences of my friends and colleagues who continue to be state workers, essentially one of the things I notice is in Connecticut we have three varieties of politicians right now. We have the Republicans who say they'll attack state workers. We have the moderate Democrats who get the endorsement of state employee unions and then attack state workers. And then we have the progressive Democrats who say that they'll defend state workers, get the support of state workers, and then attack state workers.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we will move to our lightning round, and I'd like to invite Professor Henninger back on stage. We'll kick that right off. Please try and keep your responses as close to yes or no as you can.
Is there like music that goes along with this?
I can sing if you want.
I was just thinking like the Jeopardy theme or something like that.
All right, first question. We'll start with Mr. Tong. Should Connecticut have the ability to set stricter net neutrality rules than the federal government?
Yes.
Mr. Goselin?
Yes, and California is the model for that.
Mr. Goselin, what is the last book you read?
Ooh, Beowulf.
Mr. Tong?
Team of Rivals.
All right, Mr. Tong. Greatest UConn basketball player of all time, male or female?
Maya Moore.
I'm sorry, the question again?
Greatest UConn basketball player of all time, male or female?
Oh, I haven't the faintest idea. I know, it's going to cost me votes.
Is there like a button?
Mr. Goselin, does Connecticut need an affirmative consent law?
I'm not sure what you mean by that, but if it's in the context of investigations of allegations of sexual abuse, sexual assault, yes.
Mr. Tong?
Yes, and I helped to write it.
All right. Mr. Tong, have you ever served on a jury?
No.
Mr. Goselin?
No, for some reason, they keep on bouncing me off.
Mr. Goselin?
It's your opinions.
I'm sure you've had the same experience. They don't want lawyers on juries.
Should parents or other adults be able to ban books from schools and libraries?
Absolutely not.
Mr. Tong?
No, absolutely not.
All right. Do you believe, Mr. Tong, that the state has done enough to address the problem of crumbling foundations in Connecticut?
No. Can I expand on that, or?
No.
Okay. That's not a yes or no question, but.
Well, I'm sorry. Mr. Goselin?
I agree with Mr. Tong. No, actually, I'd like to hear his answer because I know he has some insight into this topic, and I think it's a good one.
All right. Well, there's time. You have your closing remarks.
All right.
Mr. Goselin, what is the first presidential election you ever voted in?
Oh, that would be 1978. Oh, no, I'm sorry, it'd be 1980. It was Ronald Reagan. I remember that they painted they still have the big rock. The big rock is still out there, right? They painted the big rock. That was like right after we got reinstitution of draft registration under Democrat Jimmy Carter.
Mr. Tong,
Say it one more time, I'm sorry.
first presidential election you voted in?
Bill Clinton, 1992.
Okay, Mr. Tong, should all police officers be equipped with body cameras?
Yes, and I helped to write that law and provide funding for that.
Mr. Goselin?
Yes, absolutely. But it's not enough.
Mr. Goselin, what was your undergraduate major?
Which one? Let's see, it started out as English literature, but then at some point it was American history. I think my degree is in history, though.
Classics.
All right. That's the end of our questions. We will now provide 2 minutes to each candidate for closing statements. Mr. Goselin, if you please.
When we're talking about the differences between the two candidates here, obviously, we're not talking about the kind of difference that exists between either one of us and Donald Trump. But if we're going to talk about eliminating Trumpism, we have to think about how we got there. And one of the ways that we got to Trumpism was through the neoliberal and pro-austerity policies that the Democratic Party has pursued, not just in Connecticut, but all over the United States. We can't have a system that says, no, we can't tax the rich. Hands off the rich, hands off the corporations, while our schools are closing, while people don't have access to health care, while we have the opioid crisis. We need to have a political organization that's capable of fighting for the rights of working people without compromise. And when I say without compromise, I mean without having to take into consideration the wealthy donors that fund the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. I think it's great that that William has the support of both the Democratic Party and the Working Families Party. But so far, I haven't really seen an indication that the Working Families Party does much that the Democratic Party doesn't approve of. I think we have to have an independent organization. I think it has, like I said, I think it has to be built from the ground up. And I think it has to be based on the idea that we don't take money from the wealthy to fund our campaigns, and we run candidates who are working people just like us.
All right, thank you. Mr. Tong, your statement, please.
So thank you so much for having us here tonight. I'm extraordinarily proud to be the Democratic and Working Families Party nominee for Attorney General, because it's very unlikely that I would be sitting here tonight. My parents are immigrants. They came here with nothing. They worked their fingers to the bone 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, so I could have the opportunity to have a good discussion with you, Peter, here tonight, and thank you for being here. I said to the students here in the room and watching online that it's going to be on you to lead us through a difficult period in our history and to push our society into a more fair and just direction, particularly as Donald Trump weighs on all of us and has put a target on our backs. And because you raised the affirmative consent law, I think that that is a really important example of where the Attorney General can help lead the way. The affirmative consent law provides that when a young man and a young woman usually are about to engage in a sexual relationship, that in most cases the young woman needs to provide her affirmative consent. And that means that she has to say yes. And the reason why we got that through the House was because as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I explained to people, legislators on both sides, that we're trying to change the legal default rule here. For a long time, the default rule has been boys will be boys. We saw that over the last few weeks, that argument being made in Washington during the Kavanaugh hearings. And the default rule was always that the answer is yes until she says no. We need to change the default rule to the answer is no until she says yes. And as Attorney General, I'll be there on all of these important issues, explaining for people in the legislature across Connecticut, taking on the legislature if necessary and the governor to promote policies like this that encourage all of us to respect one another and keep each other safe. And that's the job of the Attorney General. I look forward to doing that job on behalf of you and your families. Thank you for having us here tonight.
All right, thank you very much. We want to thank the candidates. And I think they will take this out of here to talk about. And we'd also like to thank everyone who came out tonight. Great way to get informed. Thank you so much for being here. And special thanks to the USG External Affairs Committee for putting this debate together.